Okay, it's 2 minutes past the hour, so I think we'll get started. Hello everyone. My name is Claire Dooley. Thank you so much for joining us and taking part in this webinar. We look forward to a robust and interactive session today. I am an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'll be the chair for today's session. This webinar is hosted by LSHTM, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as the ANH Academy. So that's the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy. So first of all, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Jo Yates, to just tell everyone a little bit about the ANH Academy.
Thanks, Claire. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to this webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I just thought I would share with you a few words about what this ANH Academy is, this global network. Some of you who may not know, the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy is part of a larger program called IMANA, and that stands for Innovative Methods and Metrics for Agriculture and Nutrition Actions. And through three interlinking work streams, a competitive grants program, a fellowships program, and this global network that we call the ANH Academy, the IMANA program aims to accelerate progress on tools, data and capacity to better guide evidence-based policy on agriculture, nutrition, and health linkages. The ANH Academy goals are to build this interdisciplinary community in order to help the learning and sharing of research in agriculture, food systems, nutrition and health, to also stimulate the development of and harmonization of new types of research and evidence, and also to help strengthen the capacity of the global community of researchers to talk to one another across disciplines and sectors and break down some of those historic silos. And finally, one of the main areas that we're interested in supporting is facilitating the uptake of evidence into policies and programs. There's many different substreams within the ANH Academy itself, and I really encourage you to come and have a look and get involved. We have technical working groups that look at specific topics and try to harmonize different tools, methods and approaches and worldviews. We have a support center for agriculture and nutrition researchers that can, if you go there with a question in mind, it can help you to match data and metrics to answer that question and provides guidance. And our flagship event is the annual ANH Academy Week conference, which consists of a whole series of different workshops we call learning labs, and a abstract-driven research conference with keynotes and plenaries. And the next one is taking place in June this year, and the call for abstracts is open now, so please do consider submitting an abstract. And many other things that you can see on this page, including mentoring, capacity strengthening programs and partnerships. We have almost 6,000 members now in over 138 countries around the world, more than 60% of whom are based in Africa and Asia. And we have a really strong Big Tent ethos that guides everything we do, and that is to sort of break down hierarchies and barriers between different groups of people working on issues, and ultimately to work towards intersectoral and equitable ends to solve problems related to malnutrition and health. So thanks again for joining us today. We're really pleased that you can be with us, and if you're not already a member, then I would really encourage you to join. It's free and it's easy on our website. If you become a member, you can connect with others, you can share information, and we'll support you to do so in any way possible. You can run your own webinars. And again, I'd encourage you to have a look at our call for abstracts, which is now open. So the information about the Academy is all below. Find us on Twitter. And thanks again. Looking forward to a really interesting series of webinars. So I'm going to pass back to you now, Claire.
Thanks, Jo. Great. So just before we get started, I'd like to make a few sort of technical announcements, just to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. So first of all, I just want to note that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll post this recording on the ANH Academy website afterwards. All participants have been muted. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat box function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you're working with. And you can access the chat box by clicking on the chat speech bubble icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. The videos have also been turned off for most participants, also just to help with bandwidth issues. Later in the session, we'll open up the conversation with a Q&A section. If you have any questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the whole session, and we'll do our best to raise the questions during the Q&A portion of today's session. When doing this, please do specify which speaker your question is for. During the Q&A session, we'll also invite participants wishing to ask their questions aloud to raise their hand so that we can call on you and you can say your question aloud. Finally, if you do experience any technical issues, please do check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try and reconnect to the session using the same link that you just used to join. If you do have technical questions, please do post these in the chat box and one of our team will try and help you with any issues. Okay, so we'll get started. Thank you once again for joining. It's really great to see so many people caring about and interested in this topic. This session is the first of a three-part series on food security in humanitarian settings. Many countries across the globe are impacted by armed conflict and political fragility. In addition to tragic loss of life caused by conflict, millions are forced to live with continual threats of violence, and millions are forcibly displaced. And these are harrowing situations. There are numerous governmental agencies, non-governmental organizations, as well as research groups and research institutes, all dedicated to understanding these complex dynamics of these humanitarian contexts, as well as developing, proposing, and implementing actions that support those affected by conflict. The focus of this webinar series is food security and nutrition security, and the role of food systems approaches in developing our understanding of food security in such contexts that are very complex and wide-ranging. And this is with the overall aim of facilitating improvements in the health of affected populations. Today we'll focus on food system frameworks, and I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers. We have Makuwaza from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We have Hala Ghattas from the American University of Beirut, and Laura Hammond from SOAS, the University of London. We'll begin with presentations from each of the speakers, and then we'll hopefully have about 40 minutes for discussion and Q&A afterwards. So we will start with a presentation from Wilson. Wilson is the head of the FAO South Sudan Livestock Unit that works with more than 20 implementing partners. He has extensive experience in fragile contexts, having worked in international humanitarian and development programming since 2007, and working in both South Sudan and Afghanistan as well. Wilson has a background in clinical epidemiology, having studied at the University of Queensland in Australia, the University of Zimbabwe, and the University of Free State in South Africa. So I will hand over to you, Wilson, if you can share your screen, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. Good afternoon, participants. It's a pleasure to take part in this webinar. The presentation will focus on the experience from South Sudan with respect to food system approaches to food and nutrition security. And I think some of the issues that we experience here are more or less generic and applicable to several humanitarian and fragile contexts. I'll be looking at just a moment. Yeah. First of all, what is a food system, and what is a food system approach? And then I'll touch a bit on some process that we in South Sudan, FAO and partners, including donors, went through in 2021. And then I'll briefly touch on the sustainability questions that were identified in South Sudan. And then, of course, the agri-food system challenges. So basically, when we talk about food systems, we're looking at how food is produced at the farm level and what are the systems of production and the techniques that are applied. And then we look at the storage and the related losses, which is a big challenge in most countries. And then we know that increasingly food is getting processed. And then there are aspects related to transportation, trade and distribution, mostly by the private sector. And then we look at issues around consumption. Are we eating healthy diets? And we also look at issues related to waste and disposal of food, and the utilization of natural resources such as water, pastures, and land. So a sustainable food system is really quite important with respect to the achievement of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, particularly as an entry point for 12 out of the 17 SDGs. And a food system approach is looking at all the way from the farm to fork. And obviously there's a global dimension to it. Most like in some contexts, humanitarian contexts, most of the food would be imported. And also there's some degree of local production of food. But we not only looking at grains, but we're looking at milk, meat, eggs, etc. And we're looking at the processed food as well. And then we look at the hectares.
Wilson, very sorry to interrupt. I think we have your, we don't have the full screen of your slides, so we're just on your outline slide. I wonder if you could do, you could share full screen.
I've done that. I think it's the connectivity. Let me see.
Yeah, okay, we can see that slide now. Thanks.
All right, okay. So there are a whole range of actors along the value chain when it comes to food system approach, and it's evolving over time. And there are some drivers, the consumers, interest from the private sector, policies, and then the enabling environment itself. You know, the macroeconomic situation and public sector investments. And of course, we all know that there was a food system summit that was convened by the United Nations Secretary General last year in order to catalyze stakeholders into action. Then in humanitarian context, when you conduct a food system assessment, you want to develop a shared understanding and to look at the evidence on the challenges and opportunities that can be, collectively addressed. And then you also want to identify the entry points to advance sustainable food system transformation as a starting point for further action and dialogue and issues around policies and for the enabling environment, and then access to support, finance and investment support. And the assessment also helps to inform the programming from the by the donors, by the Food and Agriculture Organization, for instance, and by the government and other stakeholders, including NGOs. So the sustainability issues that were identified for South Sudan are outlined in this slide. There are like 4 of them. And the first one relates to resilience of the food system to human-made and natural shocks, conflict being one of them, and climate change. Increasingly, it's a big challenge in South Sudan. We've experienced widespread flooding over the past 3 years. And how do we then ensure a gradual, winning of communities from humanitarian assistance. So that's the first issue. Then the second one is with respect to the utilization of the natural resources that we find in the country, so that we end up with healthier diets and without causing any harm to the natural resources, and ensuring equitable access to food between actors in the food system. Then the third one is with respect to the development of the food system with a view towards contributing to peace, consolidation, and territorial balance. And finally, looking at development of agribusiness so that it contributes to youth and women employment, economic stabilization, and diversification and equitable wealth. So basically, this slide shows the agri-food system challenges, the drivers, the activities, and the outcomes. Basically, socioeconomic drivers, environmental drivers, food systems, activities, and then of course the outcomes that we would be expecting. So there are various aspects. Institutions are critical. Technology, the markets, the economy, the environment is quite important. And then you're looking at the importance of rural infrastructure, the agricultural services, extension, and access to technology, diet, and then of course at outcome level, you are also looking at outcomes related to the environment, food security and nutrition, and socioeconomic outcomes. Then finally, I think that should be the last slide. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Wilson. Great, thanks so much. Excellent. So we're just going to move straight on to our next speaker. So just a reminder, anybody that has any questions, please do put them in the chat box. And also just mention which speaker your question is for. Okay, so we'll move on to Hala. So Hala Ghattas is an associate research professor and director of the Center for Research on Population and Health at the American University of Beirut. Her research has focused on biological, social, and structural determinants of maternal and child health and nutrition in low resource settings, as well as within marginalized populations. Hala's background is in public health nutrition, having studied at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as St. George's in London. So I will pass over to you, Hala.
Thank you so much, Claire. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. What I'm going to do today is just briefly go over some of the specificities of food systems that populations affected by protracted crises are exposed to, and then discuss a little bit what makes these settings different to non-humanitarian settings in terms of both assessing and improving food security. And I'll just briefly discuss some of the different assessment methods and metrics, but also give a couple of examples from the context that I've been working in, which is the context of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, on food security interventions in the food system and some of the specificities that come up because this is a humanitarian context and a long-term protracted one. So similar to the framework that Wilson showed and sort of following on from his presentation, I just want to highlight 2 points here. The first being that crises put pressure on a multitude of components of food systems, as well as on the possibilities of interventions, or what we could call food system entry points. So this is clearly not a comprehensive list, but protracted crises weaken institutions. They can lead to corruption or power differentials within food supply chains. They can weaken infrastructure. There can be failures in, which often lead to failures in transport and storage, leading to food safety concerns. From an inputs perspective, there can be destruction of crops, livestock, land, water systems, infrastructure, abandonment of agricultural lands, often costs of fuel increase, leading to increased costs of production, transportation, and storage. Security issues will hinder access to land and transport, but also physical access to food markets. Often we'll see reduced competition within markets and higher food prices. And at the same time, people can be losing livelihoods, leading to reduced economic access. So lots of different pressure points within food systems in protracted crises. The second point I want to make is that the food systems that displaced populations are exposed to are different from those that that people entrapped or remaining in conflict-affected or insecure contexts are. So there are different contextual drivers that will define food production, availability, and access. And the policies, particularly for displaced populations, the policies of hosting nations or hosting communities and interactions with hosting communities will influence livelihood possibilities, for example, right to work, access to land, but also the different capabilities of the humanitarian actors to either create a food system, for example, within camps, or to interact with existing food systems, for example, through interventions such as e-vouchers, will define the possible entry points for improving food security within these food systems. So just a very broad kind of thinking about where the pressure points are and what possible interventions and what defines or dictates how interventions can be implemented within these settings. And then another sort of difference that I've always found to be interesting, if you like, is the fact that historically food insecurity assessment and metrics have differed in terms of what metrics are used in humanitarian contexts as opposed to those reported for development. And so the SDG indicators will have some overlap with, for example, IPC analyses, but not all metrics are uniform. And then who assesses food insecurity and for what purposes in terms of accountability and reporting is very different. So in stable settings, it's governments who are accountable for reporting. In humanitarian context, there's a multitude of actors that are reporting different types of data over time. And I think what's recently emerged are some initiatives at overlaying and unifying and harmonizing data from different sources, which I think will help us to think more about protracted crises as being something that's between humanitarian and development to a certain extent. And this is just an example from WFP's hunger map with data here on food consumption score from various sources. So I think these recent initiatives that try to unify and harmonize metrics and data sources across these humanitarian and development settings are ways in which some of these will help us in comparisons and unification and thinking about food systems approaches to food insecurity or improving food security in these kinds of contexts. And then just in terms of the specificities of food security interventions in protracted crises, I'm going to give a couple of examples of work that we've been involved in. The first are social protection interventions, which in stable settings are often implemented by governments. In protracted crisis settings, and this is an example from Syrian refugees in Lebanon, there have been, for example, targeted electronic food voucher and multi-purpose cash programs aiming at supporting food security in our context, for example, and they've been shown to improve diet diversity and food insecurity indicators. But some notes on these and how they operate maybe differently. The first is that the number of different actors involved is very large, and that has resulted in different eligibility for assistance and can be politicized. There's also been issues, if you like, with sustainability of these interventions, and the fact that the humanitarian envelope may increase or decrease depending on any year, and this has led to discontinuity, retargeting of these different types of aid modalities. In a context where longer term cash interventions have actually been associated with better outcomes for food security specifically. There are also considerations of how these humanitarian interventions interact with markets and what is available in a specific food system for people to use these e-vouchers or cash assistance for. And in our context, within a globalized food market where we rely a lot on import, we've had exposure to cheap energy dense foods, and there's some evidence that cost and distance to fresh food markets actually means that some of these interventions may be used to purchase foods that are not necessarily consistent with better nutrition and health. And then just one additional consideration is this tension between the urgency of instituting these aid programs versus establishing monitoring frameworks that allow for adequate impact evaluations. And I think what these protracted crises have highlighted is the importance of continued monitoring and trying to understand impact of different modalities of food and cash assistance programs. And the second example I want to give is from school feeding, again, in our context in Lebanon for Syrian refugee children and Lebanese children. So in our context, WFP has instituted an emergency school feeding program in Lebanese public schools for both Syrian refugees and Lebanese children. And there have also been pilots of more homegrown approaches to school feeding that have been implemented or piloted in our context. And a couple of things that have emerged from, again, this protracted crisis setting. The first is initially, following the standard protocols of trying to ensure, if we like, energy or caloric sufficiency for children through these school feeding programs, were critiqued in a context that was hosting largely middle income populations where we didn't really have acute malnutrition. And so over time, these programs adapted to aim to increase diet diversity by providing more fresh foods and milk and focusing on diet quality as opposed to diet quantity, and combining that, for example, with nutrition education. And then some of the issues, if you like to think about in terms of these kinds of interventions in protracted crises, is again this interaction with potentially some of the local micropolitics of food supply or local supply chains. So for example, in our context, some of these are monopolized by political parties. So what does that mean in terms of the procurement for school feeding programs? Issues related to food safety, for example, are often cited as a hindrance to these more homegrown approaches. There are also issues in terms of ownership of these programs, and how do we try to transition, as Wilson was saying, from a more humanitarian short-term approach to something that could be sustainable at national level. And in our context, ownership of these programs is problematic, with no one really wanting ownership or taking over from the humanitarian system. And then there will always be issues related to sustainability in terms of this transition from humanitarian to more long-term context. And I'm saying this as the Syrian crisis, or as Syrian refugees have now been hosted in Lebanon for almost 10 years. And so I just wanted to sort of sum up, I hope I'm still on time, that humanitarian crises pose multiple pressures on food systems, that the frameworks for assessing and intervening to improve food security have traditionally been different from non-crisis frameworks, but that there are efforts at unification and harmonization. And as crises become more protracted, issues around sustainability and accountability of interventions become really important. And in the context of globalized food systems, we really need to think about how these humanitarian interventions interact with globalized food systems to reduce any potential harm of interventions related to the types of foods that may be cheaply available in our markets. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Hala. And so finally, we'll just move on to Laura. So Laura Hammond is a professor at SOAS, the University of London. She's an anthropologist with research interests in food security, conflict, and forced migration. Laura is also the head of the London International Development Centre's Migration Leadership Team, and she is team leader for the Research and Evidence Facility of the European Union Trust Fund for Africa. Laura has worked with a wide range of development and humanitarian organizations, including UNDP, USAID, Oxfam, World Food Programme, among many, many others. So I will hand over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for the invitation to speak to you guys today. I am in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, and so I think about things. I'm also an anthropologist by training, so I think about things usually through a kind of socioeconomic, political lens, and that's where I wanted to take the discussion in the next few minutes. And I also wanted to take the discussion back to a place where I started doing my field research. I did my PhD in the northern region of Tigray in Ethiopia, which obviously is in the headlines quite a lot today for all the wrong reasons. And I thought it would be useful to kind of use the northern Ethiopia, it's not just Tigray now, but it's spread into other regions as well, the northern Ethiopia kind of example as an illustration of some of the points that I wanted to make. So I'll kind of stick with that example and go through the next few minutes. Really what I wanted to suggest in these remarks is that these questions of how to respond to protracted food crises, how to think about food security in a protracted conflict or humanitarian setting really has to always start with asking questions of political economy, thinking about who stands to win or lose from a certain situation or a certain set of arrangements, whether it's to do with access or it's to do with territory or collaboration with aid actors, et cetera. All of those are really highly influenced by political and economic questions. And so, you know, we can talk about how in a best world to respond to humanitarian crises in these kinds of circumstances, but a lot of it is really dictated by what's possible and what the relationships are with those conflict actors or those power brokers. In the situation in Ethiopia, just really very, very briefly for anyone who's perhaps not familiar with the details, but there's been an internal conflict which started in November 2020, so recently passed the 1-year mark. It focused on the northern Tigray region and areas bordering it in the Amhara and Afar regions. And so far, over 60,000 refugees have fled the country and are sheltering in Sudan. At least 2 million, definitely more than 2 million people are internally displaced. The number of people targeted for assistance in the 3 affected regions is 9.4 million. which is up from 5.2 million, which was an assessment figure in May 2021. And you have to take these assessment figures with a sort of a pinch of salt, because there's been so little access to and coverage of the situation going on in conflict affected areas that it's really a kind of best guess. No one, there's not been very much presence on the ground, and it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on. And so the conflict has ebbed and waned in various ways. In about October of last year, it spread quite dangerously close to the capital, Addis Ababa. But then in the last month or so, the Tigrayan forces have retreated or withdrawn, depending on who you talk to, really more up into the north. And so some of the areas that were badly affected by humanitarian needs are able to at least try to come back to some semblance of recovery. But certainly there are huge areas that are still not able to reach that point. And I just thought, I don't have a lot of slides, I just wanted to talk to you, but I thought it might be useful to have a map just for people who may not be aware of or familiar with the region. So here's a map of northern and eastern Ethiopia, and the dark red or the dark pink kind of color are the areas that are hardest to reach. The sort of salmon color are those that are partly accessible. And so you can see it's a vast area of northern Ethiopia, and also into the south along the Oromia-Somali regional border, that are problematic to reach people who are in need. And so the first thing to think about in this kind of context, so we're not, there's a question, is this a protracted humanitarian crisis? Well, it's been going on for over a year. But we typically tend, when we talk about protracted displacement, for instance, we talk about people who've been displaced for 5 years, so not at that situation yet. But I think when you consider the current political sort of stalemate that exists between the opposing sides, and think about what the impact will be, particularly on food security, one can say that this is a protracted crisis in the making, and it's virtually certain that it will become protracted. And that and not be alleviated anytime in the near future. So what we've seen in the first year of this conflict has been the instrumentalization of food as a weapon of war, which has involved attacking and blocking access to farmland, impeding food aid deliveries and the movements of traders, attacking markets, attacking food distribution points, attacking refugee camps, attacking IDP settlements. All of these things, of course, are violations of international humanitarian law, which considers the intentional using of starvation as a tactic of war towards civilians to be a war crime. And there's all sorts of law that it's meant to try to prevent these things from occurring, but we can see that that there are flagrations of those forms of international law, probably on both sides of the conflict. And so, in addition to that, there's been a real lack of access. As I said, there's a lack of information about what the needs are within the affected areas, but that also has resulted in a lack of fuel to deliver food aid, or to even to assess the situation, a lack of cash. The banking systems are completely closed, lack of communications, telecommunications between the affected areas and areas outside. And so, again, to kind of think about this broad picture question of food security and conflict in a broader picture than just than the question of is food available, is the question of what are the different kinds of elements of society, in a sense, that are necessary in order for food to become available. So there's a lack of freedom of movement. Traders are not able to get from one marketplace to another. They're not able to bring goods into the regions in order to serve the local populations. A lot of people, particularly in the poorest of the poor of northern Ethiopia, depend on labor migration for up to 2 months a year. They typically would go towards the western part of a contested area of has been called Western Tigray, to kind of along the Sudan border, if you can see my cursor, but along between Eritrea, Sudan, and this kind of triangle area here around the town of Humera. And people have been traveling working in those areas for a few months a year in order to supplement the income that they get from their own on-farm employment or food production. And those possibilities are broken. We've seen as well that when the conflict started in November 2020, that was the beginning of the harvest season. So that harvest was pretty much lost. People were displaced from across the region and particularly out of Western Tigray, and therefore were not able to plant. So this should be the second harvest, which is now lost. And the prospects for being able to plant very much in the upcoming agricultural season, which should start in kind of March, April, May in this area, are virtually nil. So we can see that already the seeds of this protracted conflict, protracted humanitarian situation and food insecurity situation are well on their way. So there'll be, at least we're talking about 3 failed harvests. And for the western part of this conflict affected area, it's really important, not just for local food production, but for surplus food production that serves much of the rest of the country as well. This area that I'm calling Western Tigray has been a kind of food basket for producing sorghum in particular, and sesame for export, so a source of foreign currency for many, many years. And so with the breakdown and the displacement of not just smallholders, but also the breakdown of commercial agricultural producers, the prospects for that, for any production coming out of that area are pretty weak. In terms of thinking about how assistance gets delivered in this area, again, it's really heavily influenced by the political economy questions. So until very recently, until this conflict broke out, most humanitarian and development assistance was delivered through a local NGO, which claimed to be the largest local NGO in Africa, the Relief Society of Tigray, which was originally, when the conflict broke out, blacklisted, and its executive director was thrown in prison, where he still remains, with the seizure of control by the Tigray regional forces against the federal government in recent months. REST has been able to start to be somewhat operational in some parts of the region, but many parts still remain out of reach. So when you think more broadly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but when you think more broadly about future scenarios and you think about what would happen, even in the best case scenario, if there were to be a resolution of this conflict, at least a peace agreement or a cessation of hostilities in the near term, would that bring about an end to this protracted crisis? I have to say the answer is certainly no. You can think about the kinds of steps that would need to be taken for recovery to take place, which would have to involve not just a political solution, but also a resolution to disputed land claims, particularly in the western part of this conflict zone, as well as along the southern edges between Tigray and Amhara regions. And those don't seem to be forthcoming at all. Those will be the trickiest parts of any kind of peace agreement. So if people are not able to return to those areas, some of which are extremely fertile farming areas, then food security will be a real problem going into the future. Beyond that as well, one needs to consider that vulnerability is unevenly distributed, of course, like as in any society. So some people, many people in Ethiopia are what we would call chronically food insecure and are reliant on some form of food and or income support on a regular basis, and always and have been pretty much for their whole lives. And so those kinds of what we call the productive safety net program that's been in operation for many years now. If the productive safety net program is not able to operate, then those people who've have been regularly dependent upon food assistance and livelihood support, again, are without that, even without factoring in what the impact of the conflict has been. And so you have this kind of uneven picture of vulnerability, even amongst those areas where the need is greatest. There will, of course, as well within society be, the displaced, elderly people who are less able to support themselves through their own employment or farm production that will be among the more needy. So important to think about the kind of differential distribution of vulnerability. And so really important to just think about how, as access is restored in a post-conflict kind of scenario, what would that entail? It's not just about opening up an area and allowing allowing actors in, but it's also about restoration of the production links, the trade links. Freedom of movement is really important. People need to be able to move to places where they can seek off-farm employment or agricultural wage labor. A restoration of the banking system so that people can actually access credit in order to carry out their agricultural activities, to rebuild their livestock herds. All of that is at the moment lacking. Really, and I think also important to recording stop. That mobility is really important to that key for people to be able to move from one place of safety to another, to be able to move themselves as well as goods and things that they produce from one area to another. It's in a situation like this. I mean, when I first lived in Tigray in the early 1990s, it was another post-conflict scenario at the end of a previous civil war that went on from 1975 until 1991. And it was very evident that when people are returning from being displaced, the local economies are not adequate to support large numbers of people. And so it was really important to have ties to markets in other places, in bigger towns, in the capital city, across the border in Sudan or in Eritrea. And those kinds of opportunities provide a real engine for recovery that will take time to be developed. So all of this just to use this example to highlight the real importance, the significance of asking these questions around political economy, around who stands to benefit from keeping access closed, what kinds of power relations and disputes and potential interests are at play in trying to resolve some of these land tenure issues, and what are the wider issues beyond production, nutrition, need that might relate to access to auxiliary resources like fuel, like fertilizer, like credit, that may also help to influence the food assessment. So the sort of food aid and the food security picture going forward. So I'm going to end it there, I think. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Laura. Yes, a huge amount to think of when just thinking about progress forwards. You know, you raise so many issues. It seems like, you know, a very sort of a mountain to climb in some of these areas. So we're going to move on to questions, and so I would like to start. So I'll ask one question, and then I will invite each of the speakers to respond. And please do keep your responses to just 2 or 3 minutes. And then we have quite a few questions from participants. Okay, so I think we'll start with Wilson. So this is a question to all 3 speakers. Just thinking about just picking out one key element. So can you pick out one key element or name one key element of food systems that really needs to change to improve food security in these contexts? And also what actions are needed to achieve this?
Thank you very much, Claire. I think it would take much more than 3 minutes to address the question. Basically, you would want to focus, I'm talking in the context of South Sudan, on the 4 main sustainability issues that are highlighted in the presentation. So as we all know, man-made, shocks are quite a big challenge in South Sudan. And at the same time, you're looking at natural shocks, floods, for instance, and droughts to some extent. So climate change, that will be a big issue. So for us to ensure food security for all, and to ensure that communities and the country, across the country, are less dependent on humanitarian assistance, we need to address issues related to governance, peace, security, stability, and at the macroeconomic level as well. We also need to look at trade and taxation policies. These are quite a challenge in South Sudan. And then you also want to strengthen institutions so that there's a multi-sector approach to food system development, and maybe to allocate financial and human resources for the same purpose. And then food quality and safety. Most of the food is imported. I think it's an area to look into. And then you also want to focus on technical and institutional innovations. The pastoral field school approach is important, and farmer field schools as well, and maybe to utilize locally based extension service delivery. Service delivery through, when it comes to livestock, we work through community animal health workers. And they've proven to be effective in the absence of a formal extension services system, and in the face of very poor infrastructure. I would say for livestock, I think there's need to look at value addition, because more than 65% of the population of South Sudan depends on livestock for their livelihoods in one way or another. And there's also need to adopt climate resilient technologies. Then diversification of livelihoods is also quite important. And then at the community level, seed production should be encouraged so that there's some level of self-reliance and to avoid the current dependence on donations and uncontrolled imports. I could go on and on, but there are also issues to do with infrastructure, transportation, roads network across the country, and that really negatively impacts on the development of value chains. And then perhaps to utilize solar-based technologies to set up cold storage facilities and reduce post-harvest losses. And I think I'll leave it at that, but there's more that still would need to be looked at. Conflict mitigation, issues to do with the land tenure. It's a big challenge in the country. Access to financial resources is a big issue. I'll stop there, Claire, in the interest of time.
Thanks, Wilson. And next over to you, Hala. A key element of food systems that needs to change, and also the actions that are required to achieve that.
Yeah, so again, this is a really big question, but I think one thing we need to consider is where any food system that is, whether in crisis or not, is situated, and its relation with sort of the globalized food system. I think that is extremely important in terms of defining, if you like, sort of what food ends up in markets and what food ends up being available for populations affected by crises to access. Using Lebanon as an example at the moment, the big problem that we are facing right now is that we have sort of multiple crises on top of each other. So we host up to about 1 million Syrian refugees in a context where we are going through our own economic crisis. And in our context, I think the two really key issues to think about is how does we're in a system where we have complete failure of government governance and economic systems. And so what are components of the food system that can re-trigger normal economic activity so that people can generate livelihoods and then access food on markets at reasonable prices. We've had food price inflation that's been exponential in the last 2 years, as well as currency inflation. So for me, I think the big issues are around how do you get a market to stabilize in a context of crisis, and what are some key from two sides, from a livelihoods perspective, how can people generate incomes within these kinds of contexts that would allow them to access food, and then how can you stabilize food markets in a context that is going through active crisis. I think those are big questions. I don't have answers on actions needed to address them, but I think these are the ways that we need to be thinking about these food systems and food systems in crisis. Thanks.
Thanks, and over to you, Laura.
Yeah, I think all of the points that have been made by previous two speakers have been really well put in. There's not a huge amount to add that I wouldn't add to that, except, I think in a place like Ethiopia, where I'm talking about, where you have not just people who are affected by need, but also people who have been principally involved in producing food for themselves, for their own area that's now conflict affected, but even for the wider area, it's important to kind of see those sites as being kind of integral parts of the overall food production and food system, nationally, as well as sometimes regionally. Important. I think sometimes the possibilities of local procurement, of influencing food security outcomes through provision of cash rather than through provision of food, despite the fact that we've been talking more and more about those over recent years, haven't been as well, or not as well recognized and taken to heart as they might otherwise be. I think I'll just leave it there, and then we can have time for more discussions.
Great, thank you. And yeah, just to mention, in our next session of this webinar series, we have a few case studies that focus on exactly that, the transition from food aid and transitioning to cash assistance. Okay, so we're going to take questions from our participants. So please, if you have a question and you would like to say it out loud and address it directly to the speakers, please do raise your hand, and we will invite you to unmute yourself, and so that you can ask your question. But I'm going to start with one from the chat box. So this question is for Hala, and so this relates to policies. So the question is from Melody, and the question is, are there any policies implemented in Lebanon to improve the livelihoods of forcibly displaced communities? If yes, to what extent are these policies implemented?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the big issues for refugees in Lebanon thus far have been that legal frameworks don't really permit, if you like, the diversification of livelihoods and the generation of sustainable livelihoods. So there have been various policies that counter this, in fact. So lack of civil documentation, work permits, registration options for refugees, particularly Syrian refugees at the moment, but also previously there were many restrictions on the right to work for Palestinian refugees, which only have recently been removed. So there is a slight positive policy direction as relates to Palestinian refugees' rights, but these restrictions on various, the legal restrictions, if you like, have actually impeded the ability of refugees to work in the formal sector, which means that they largely resort to the informal sector. And so that has actually constrained their ability to work and generate livelihoods as opposed to supporting livelihoods. The one positive note in our context has been a recent change in policy as regards to Palestinian refugees' right to work. Thanks. Claire, you're muted. We can't hear you.
think if Claire's muted, then perhaps we can move on to the next question. Let's just have a quick look to see what that is. So, Claire, unless if you come back in at any stage, you can just let me know. But such is life with online world. So this is a question for Wilson, but again, if anyone else wants to jump in and answer as well, could you give some examples and context about how this mapping or strategy has been implemented, and what actions have been taken to try and address food system improvements in South Sudan in particular?
Oh, thank you very much. I think as FAO, we work very closely with the ministries of livestock, and that's in line with our mandate, as well as with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. And we have, over the years, been supporting the capacity development for the, I'm sure you'll be aware of the integrated phase classification. So the whole issue to do with IPC, we invested a lot over the years. The IPC, as you know, is really quite important in terms of planning for humanitarian and, let me say, and development interventions as well. So that's number one in terms of capacity development. And then secondly, there's what is called the Comprehensive Agriculture Master Plan. It's a multi-year master plan for the agriculture sector. I think it's something that we use as a tool for advocacy. At the moment, South Sudan invests an estimated 0.4% of its budget towards agriculture on an annual basis, and that is far less than 10% as recommended in the Maputo Declaration. You may be aware of that one. So instead of 10%, in order to support 6% growth, annual growth of the agriculture sector, that is not happening. So I think there are various projects that FAO implements, working in partnership with major development partners, the European Union, the World Bank, USAID, and we are also implementing some projects that contribute towards conflict mitigation. And in addition, we invest in infrastructure along the food value chain, like for livestock slaughter facilities and marketing facilities. We also look into issues of post-harvest losses when it comes to crop production. And we have been supporting, the desert locust response and fall armyworm, just to mention a few. So there's quite a lot that has been done. So in terms of policies and strategies, I think there is some support that we've provided, including for the livestock development in the whole country. And then we have a network of extension service providers at local level in rural areas. I mentioned community animal health workers, but we also have extension associates for crop production. I don't know if that really addresses the question, Joe. Over to you.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Wilson. Fascinating responses. And I think Claire's mic has now come back, so I'm going to pass back.
Thanks, Joe. Apologies for that. Excellent. Thanks, Wilson. Yeah, really, really very insightful. So the next question is for Laura. So this is a question from Olive. Thanks. This is a question from Olive. So last year's UN Food System Summit resulted in lots of commitments made by lots of member states and actors, including a HDPN coalition. What are your reflections on the summit outcomes from the perspective of food systems in conflict contexts?
Thanks, Olive. It's nice to see your comment. Olive and I worked together on something a few years ago. But I think one of the issues it's great to see food security and humanitarian support in conflict contexts brought to the level of a global summit. But one of the difficulties, I think, is that the parties involved tend to be states. And so you can have certain state commitments, but in the kind of context in which I've just discussed, where a state is a belligerent in the conflict and has publicly declared itself to be not interested really in the humanitarian outcomes of some of its citizens, you have other issues as well. That may be a limited kind of an approach. And so what's I think really important is that in a sense is more an approach more akin to the kind of responsibility to protect, in which those who fight conflicts are held to the standard that states should be held to, whether they are states or not, whether they're rebel movements who aspire to statehood or to state power or not, are kind of held to the same kinds of expectations, but also are engaged with as well. And I think that's one of the difficulties that the UN, and I've worked with the UN in the past, but the UN has a difficulty sometimes in engaging with actors who are not state parties. And that's certainly been a situation in the case of Ethiopia, where many UN personnel have been expelled from the country, not for speaking out in terms of who's right or wrong in the conflict, but just for commenting on humanitarian needs and on the fact that there is famine going on in the north, that already has become a political statement. And that becomes extremely problematic when international organizations that are supposed to be neutral and impartial, but yet have to work primarily through the silos of government action, are sort of attempted to be silenced in that way. So really important that as a start, but also really important to broaden the net web of engagement to include engaging with other non-state actors, but as well to involve those kind of organizations and bodies that are not perhaps so constrained by who they can speak with, particularly the NGO sector. The third sector is often better placed to do that in some cases than many UN agencies or bilateral actors as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Laura. And so the next question is from Emmanuel, and this is relating to conflict between crop farmers and cattle herders. So I wonder, Wilson, perhaps you can comment on this one. So the question is, can you suggest ways that food crop farmers and cattle herders can work together? What symbiotic relationships can they develop? Since protracted conflicts among them hinders the food system, and we need both actors to be participating in the system.
Thanks, Claire. That's a very topical issue in the context of the work that we do. I'll mention at the same time that there's quite a lot of cattle raiding, you may want to call it cattle rustling related conflict in South Sudan. And we now shifted the narrative and we say it's actually livestock, animals are the victim. There are so many factors driving that kind of conflict. But of course, the dimension of conflict between livestock owners and farmers has become quite a bit more pronounced, especially over the past, let me say, going back to 2013, for two reasons. Because of internal displacement due to a conflict, and then secondly, internal displacement over the last 3 years due to flooding across the country. And so we've got a situation in which livestock owners have moved to their non-traditional locations, have and they have not gone back to their original locations. It has become an issue. So basically, we've got a project which we are supported by the UN Joint Trust Fund. We're implementing it over a 3-year period, and we consider that to be like the first phase of implementation of a joint UN strategy to mitigate cattle raiding related conflict. But in the same vein, we also looking at trying to promote dialogue between livestock owners and farmers in a different location. So that would be the first, the next phase, and we'll be looking into this quite keenly. It has become a problem, and yet at the same time, us as service providers, even when the livestock owners are displaced to their non-traditional locations, we still offer vaccination and treatment services for their livestock. And then we are caught in between. There's a possibility of being seen as trying to encourage them to remain in those locations. Yeah. So I think it's a very valid question. It's of concern in South Sudan at the moment, and the confounder is of course conflict and the floods, which we think are related to climate change. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely a balancing act. Yeah, and many different factors to think about in those situations. So I think we'll just do 2 final questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So the first question, so these 2 will be addressed to all speakers. If I can call on each of you in turn to answer the question. So, obviously everyone would like to see an end to humanitarian crises, but obviously that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so could I just ask you each to comment on what you think the future looks like for humanitarian situations? Do you think it's going to get worse? What are the worse or better, and what are the kind of factors influencing that? So just how do you see the future of humanitarian situations evolving? And so perhaps Hala, you could take this one first.
Yeah, I mean, I think as everyone has commented, I think we're seeing more long-term and protracted crises that are extremely complex. And I think we're going to have to sort of find ways to come up with more sustainable solutions and transitions between sort of short-term food aid and longer-term interventions that could have long-term outcomes. But I mean, I don't know if I can't predict whether I'm more optimistic or pessimistic as relates to this. But one thing that has emerged more recently in our context has been these sort of new potential livelihood solutions that are not constrained by national boundaries. People can be techno-skeptic, but this idea of remote working, there's been a lot, and actually interestingly, interventions by WFP to actually train refugees in digital skills so that they're actually able to rely on external sources of livelihoods that aren't necessarily constrained by legal frameworks of national hosting countries. So I think that there may be opportunities for new emerging ways to think about sustainable livelihoods in contexts of crises. But yeah, I'm not sure I can predict whether that's necessarily going to be a positive sort of shift. I think these sort of adaptations that communities themselves have tend to allow them somehow to survive within very difficult circumstances. And that sort of relates to what's being termed as resilience. And again, we can critique these kinds of frameworks as being a little bit hands-off and less engaged with affected populations, or see them as engaging these populations. So, I mean, I think some of these sort of questions are around. So I think the answer. I think the answer is very much we don't know how what the future will look like for humanitarian situations. But I think there are some potential positive developments. But again, as Laura has alluded to, these power imbalances, these these issues are largely political, and we end up working one step further from the politics, because if the political solutions were able to address these crises, then we wouldn't be having to deal with many of the upstream consequences of conflict. So clearly, I think maybe food security actors need to be engaging somehow with peace building as well, but I don't know if we're actually sufficiently trained and prepared to do so, but I think these are some of the ways forward. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and very, very interesting to hear about opening up to sort of an international job market as one of the strategies. Is really interesting. Laura, could I hand over to you?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking when you asked the question, I thought there's two ways to answer this question. One is, are there likely to be fewer humanitarian crises going in the future? And I think the answer to that is probably not. And then the question of whether or not the current crises that we're seeing, Syria, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, etc., whether there's any chance of moving beyond humanitarian crisis. And there, I think, it would be great if we could see an end to some of these crises, but again, I don't think there's too much room for optimism in many respects. South Sudan maybe has got more room for optimism than in other places. Interesting to think whether or not that's true, Wilson. But one thing that I think is really true is that as humanitarian actors and as people who are engaged in thinking about food systems and humanitarian crises, we need to get better at not at moving into, as crises become protracted, at trying to think about using different tools and different systems for responding. We continually tend to use humanitarian tools even to respond to situations in protracted crisis, in which some of those tools are no longer really sort of fit for purpose, if you like. And what I mean by that is, if people have been displaced for 10, 15, 20 years, thinking about whether they have adequate access to food as opposed to what the quality of their food is. And Hala mentioned those questions around dietary quality being really important, particularly in the longer term, become, micronutrients and access to quality of diet become much more significant and important, as does questions of livelihood security more broadly than food security. And if you have more broad livelihood security that's not entirely based on aid dependency, then you're much more likely to have food security as well. But I think as a sector, as a humanitarian industry, if you like, it's been very slow to pick up any kinds of different tools or to develop different tools than the kind of ones that were created for really short-term humanitarian emergencies and crisis. And so hopefully we can move more into that direction as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. And Wilson?
Yeah, I would think, for South Sudan, whilst it might all look gloomy, Claire, there's a bit of optimism. I think over the past year or two, I think the security situation is largely improved. I'm looking at the food system, which is in deep crisis and vulnerable to multiple shocks from conflict, from climate change, etc. And of course, this affects productivity and competitiveness. And yet, there are multiple opportunities for the transformation of the food system that could respond positively to some of the sustainability issues that I mentioned before. So you're looking at a country that has a young population on a vast territory, and it's got a wide range of natural resources. So that on its own can allow for extremely diverse food products in a sustainable manner. And there's a growing demand for affordable food. And I'm talking in terms of the rural population as well as a fast-growing urban population. Yes, so I think whilst the drivers of the various shocks and crises are obviously beyond the domain of food systems, I think there's some hope. I'll mention something quite interesting here. When you look at the literacy levels across the country, and I'm sure you'll agree that that is quite a key driver of all sorts of shocks. We started to implement, let me say 3 to 4 years ago, a project that focuses on providing education to on the move, so to speak, alternative education to the youth within what we call cattle camps. So it's a pastoralist way of livestock production, moving from one location to the other. But we, together with UNESCO and the government, we came up with a curriculum that looks at improving access to education for the hard to reach kind of communities. So we think in a way that will help towards enabling them to be able to access skills to diversify their livelihoods, and then perhaps that will have an impact on food systems. In a nutshell, Claire, that will be all from me. Over.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, education being sort of the key point there. We have just over 5 minutes left, so I think we'll start to wrap up. So could I just ask each of the panelists to kind of give a very brief kind of your key take-home message, and so your key take-home message and a recommendation or a suggested solution for how we can move forward in tackling these challenges that you've highlighted. So perhaps Hala, if you could go first.
So I think key take-home message is that yes, we're facing more protracted humanitarian crises. We do need to think of the long term more. The food systems that different populations affected by protracted crises are exposed to have various very different specific contextual factors, and we will need, I think it's very difficult to come up with very broad recommendations that apply everywhere. I think we're going to need to sort of keep using these different analytical tools and frameworks that we have to look at where within those specific food systems we can have long-term effectiveness for improving food security. And I think within that, it's going to be really important to build in monitoring and evaluation frameworks that allow us to really assess the impact of these different types of interventions. Because if we are truly recommending that we need new approaches, then we also need to understand whether these work. And I think that's going to be critical moving forward. So integrating impact assessment, long-term, looking at long-term, because crises are becoming more protracted, we can no longer also look at the short-term impacts of these interventions, but rather start to look at the longer-term impacts of interventions within these kinds of settings. Thank you.
Thanks. And Wilson?
Yeah, Claire, I think it will be very important to anchor the food systems approach within strategies. I'm looking at donor strategies, humanitarian actors, UN agencies, the governments, and to mainstream the approach in all interventions. For instance, if WFP is doing a food distribution intervention, if there's a possibility, they should also look at supporting the seed system and access to markets for the farmers. And then I think there's a big role for the private sector when it comes to the supply chains. In fact, in South Sudan, especially with respect to inputs, it's a big challenge because the private sector is not very well developed. So sustainability of supply chains is important. Then, of course, we should focus more on the peace and development nexus, linking humanitarian assistance with, say, development and conflict mitigation. I think that would be it from me, Claire.
Thanks, Wilson. And over to you, Laura.
Yeah, thanks. I think I would, at the risk of repeating myself too much, just really reiterate the importance of understanding the political context in which these crises are taking place and speaking to and keeping avenues of communication open with as many of the different sort of power brokers as possible. I think as well, there have been some interesting new ways of thinking. I know I was involved with UNDP and UNHCR in the recent high-level panel on internal displacement, looking at the ways in which humanitarian sort of more short-term support to displaced people could be transitioned into longer-term support and more development-oriented support. And that same, and key, of course, to supporting a displaced population is it doesn't have to be a displaced population in the sense of talking about food systems. It applies to everyone, but really trying to have longer-term planning windows, longer-term programming and funding windows is really key. We can learn a lot from looking at how humanitarian crises have been responded to in the past to inform our understanding of how they are responded to in the present and the future. And we can say with just about 100% certainty that in virtually every case of protracted conflict that's going on in the world now, donors will lose interest and pull their funding long before the needs have subsided. And so we need to find a way of getting around that or solving that particular challenge, because if those kinds of challenges are not met, then we're not really going to have a transformed approach towards food systems in protracted conflict situations. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Laura. So I think we need to wrap up. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This has been very, very interesting and given everyone a huge amount to think about. Just finally, please do, to all the participants, please do sign up to our register for our second and third sessions, which will be happening in February in a few weeks' time. So the second session will be looking at the evidence base, and so we'll look at case studies from different areas of the world. And then the third session will be looking at data acquisition and the future of data collection and how this can support progress moving forwards. Thank you everyone so much for joining, and a huge, huge thank you to the speakers. You've been absolutely fantastic and really, really, really interesting session. So thank you very much.